Hello. So in this video for Black History Month 2025, we're going to be talking about Michael Jai White's film Outlaw Johnny Black. This is a Blaxploitation revisionist Western comedy. It follows and satirizes a lot of the sort of traditional elements of Western films. It does so really with an eye toward sort of taking apart the genre. But it's also really philosophically interesting, right? So, I mean, there's elements like, basically it's a revenge story. As a child, Johnny Black witnessed his father being gunned down by a guy, an outlaw named Brett Clayton. And so Johnny has sworn revenge. He has chased Brett Clayton through the years, becoming increasingly a better, faster shot, etc., etc. He is stranded in the desert for a while. And then you have the sort of anti-hero comes to town figure, because Johnny Black falls in with this guy, or more properly gets rescued from the desert by this guy named Reverend Percy Fairman Jr. When Native Americans attack, and the depiction of Native Americans in this movie is fairly problematic. It's done for comedic effect in a similar sort of vein to something like Blazing Saddles, and the way that Mel Brooks's depiction of indigenous peoples in Blazing Saddles is not exactly good, or, I don't know, politically correct at the very least. White's film has very awkward depictions of indigenous people. For instance, the leader of this group of Native Americans is played by Russell Peters, who is Indian. Not Native American, not First Nations Canadian, because he is actually from Canada, Indian from India. His family is from India. So that's a decision that was made. But like, again, the film clearly is going for satire and absurdity, because like they have a bit where Peters picks up, I think it's a bottle of whiskey that a drunk guy has left on the ground, and they zoom in on his face and the one teardrop, which is of course a sort of throwback to the old, itself fairly problematic recycling commercial with the Native American chieftain with the one tear. So we've got that stuff. But basically, Percy, they get attacked by this group of Native Americans, and Percy Fairman Jr. Is shot with an arrow. Johnny Black doesn't realize that has hit his Bible and has not actually killed him. And so Johnny assumes Percy's identity, goes to this town. Basically, he's trying to dodge the law, but he sort of gets sucked into this situation where the congregation collectively has a tremendous amount of money, and he wants to steal it. He's also being courted by Bessie Lee, who is Percy's fiance. But Johnny also falls in love with Jessie Lee, her sister, who is the sort of the voice of justice in this town, right? She's educated. She has a sense of the law and the protections that it theoretically offers to people, etc., etc. So she stands up against Tom Shealy, so most of the inhabitants, not all of the inhabitants, but most of the inhabitants of this town seem to be African American. Tom Shealy and his men are mostly white. And Shealy realizes that there is oil on church property, and so he wants this land. It's your classic Wild West rich guy land grab. All the poor farmers and fucking townspeople and whatnots getting thrown off their land. They refuse to sell out to the rich dick, and so he tries to destroy them, tries to run them off. Again, somewhat like Blazing Saddles. It is revealed that so Percy survives. Percy Fairman survives. He ends up making his way to this town. Hope Springs is the name of the town. And he's basically like, hey, Johnny Black, you stole my identity. And Johnny manages to convince him to go along with this charade where Johnny will continue being Percy, and Percy will play a character named Deacon. He is going to be Percy's deacon from back in Georgia, and his first and last name are Deacon because they don't come up with a name before announcing that this is who he is. And so they improvise incredibly badly, and everybody's like, yeah, that just makes sense. Perfect thing. That's a name that a person would have. So again, there's all this satire. And there's and so basically it sort of ends up with this sort of big Wild West showdown, right? Where Brett Clayton at the head of the Rough Riders, which is apparently just this group of outlaws hired by Tom Shealy, come into town. The townsfolk, led by Johnny Black, fight back, and they end up winning. Along with the sort of basic plot line and the satire of various elements, there's a really interesting core philosophical question that I think this film grapples with. And I think it's an important one in the context of the African American experience, which is forgiveness or justice. So Johnny's father, Bullseye Black, had been a preacher. We see him deliver one sermon, and that sermon is about forgiveness and about how forgiveness frees you from the shackles of negative affect, I suppose. But how forgiveness is freeing. It is liberating, which is, of course, a thematic that really would resonate with African American audiences in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, whenever exactly this is set. I don't know that it specifies a particular year, but Old West era, right? So many African American adults would have been enslaved. So the theme of liberation, the theme of freeing oneself, would, of course, be emotionally resonant. Young Johnny poses this question after the sermon. His dad asks him about it, about the message of this sermon, and Johnny asks, what about justice? And that becomes kind of the crux of the film, is it ethically, spiritually, practically better to forgive someone who has wronged you and no longer carry the burden of that anger? Or is it more important to seek justice and so balance the world, to balance out the wrongdoing that someone or others have done to you? And I think this is a really central philosophical question for the African American experience, because so much of the African American experience has been characterized by suffering wrongs, whether that be through slavery, whether that be through Jim Crow, whether that be through segregation, whether that be through the long history of police violence and often extrajudicial murders of African Americans that drove the Black Lives Matter movement, whether that be the continued heritage of over-policing African American communities and disproportionate severity of prison sentences for African Americans convicted of crimes, whether that be the continued relative dearth of generational wealth compared to white Americans on average. Whatever it is, all of these elements that are all bound up in systemic racism and, to a lesser extent, individual racism, right? Is it the right thing to do for African Americans, sort of collectively or individually, to try and forgive and to free themselves from anger, resentment, whatever it is? Or is it the right thing to do to seek justice? To say, no, this situation, this is not a just world. This is not a world in which equality, freedom, the promises of America are embodied. And so we are going to resist. We are going to, in some way, fight back against this system. And what, of course, does it mean to do that? Because the other big question that is introduced by this is, what does it mean to pursue justice for a wrong? Johnny spends his life trying to avenge his father's death, pursuing Brett Clayton with the intention of killing him. And the film, I think, is interested in the question of whether or not that actually is justice. Is that justice, or is that just revenge? Just revenge in the sense of merely revenge, not in the sense of revenge that is just. Or is it revenge that is just? And I think the fact that Johnny has as he's called upon in the guise of Reverend Percy to preach a sermon, and the only sermon that he can think of, because he has given up on religion after his father was murdered, is the one that we heard his father preach earlier in the film about forgiveness and freeing oneself. And as Johnny preaches that sermon, he has this revelation, right? That what he needs to do for himself is to forgive Brett Clayton. But the film itself doesn't just leave it there. This is not a situation in which Johnny is personally liberated and has some kind of spiritual victory over the villainous Brett Clayton, because it does end with the showdown in which Johnny kills Clayton. Even though Johnny Johnny tells Brett Clayton at the beginning of the big fight scene at the end, I have forgiven you. I am liberated by that. But they still have their fight, and Johnny still wins. And so there is, I don't know what to make of that. Because on the one hand, it almost seems like this is trying to cheat the philosophical tension of the film, right? Johnny can forgive Clayton and still get his revenge. That the two things are not mutually exclusive. it seems on the one hand like this is eliding the central question of the film of which one is the more ethical path. On the other hand, it complicates it in a way that is, I think, probably productive, because I think it introduces the question of whether you can have true, meaningful forgiveness without justice of some kind. And I think that's an interesting take. And it is then subsequently worth noting that Johnny, who now becomes the town sheriff, having been sort of pardoned by U.S. Marshal Cove, Johnny lays out this vision for Hope Springs of a multicultural town, city, whatever it is, in which people of all different ethnicities, people of all different cultural backgrounds can live together in harmony, and the town collectively will celebrate their differences, but also the things that connect them, the things that make them similar. And I think that's ultimately kind of the interesting ethical move of this film, which is the idea that in order to progress toward an equitable society in which you have justice, or in which you preclude the need for justice, even, right? In which you have a society in which people exist collectively and support one another, a cosmopolitan culture, you need both to forgive the wrongs of the past, but also to establish justice for them. Both things need to occur before you can have the creation of a properly multicultural society.